In 4 car crash interviews, Education Secretary Nadhim Zahawi has been repeatedly schooled. He was speaking to the media to announce additional education spending and took the opportunity to boast about the Tories' generosity when it comes to pouring money into children's futures. But no one was buying it. Let's start with Sophie Ridge on Sky News.
The schools have struggled, haven't they, with years of effectively underfunding. I just want to show this graph that I think we should be able to bring up now. This is the funding gap between state and private schools since the Conservatives entered power. You can see the change of funding, the change of per pupil funding. So you can see there, the blue line is private schools. That's the fees that parents pay per pupil in private schools. The red line is state school spending per pupil, and this is the change per pupil. The dotted line, 2010, when the Conservatives entered power. If you're a parent looking at this, what do you think you would conclude about how the Conservatives prioritise state school pupils?
So you'll remember in 2008-9, that was the financial crash and the crisis that led to us having to tighten our belts and, of course, try and get the economy back on its feet. Thank goodness we managed to do that, because then we got the pandemic, where we've had to spend $400 billion making sure that people's jobs are protected and, of course, businesses are protected. But if you look at the settlement I've just got, is an additional $7 billion by 2024-25. Much of it front-loaded, by the way. So $4 billion of that comes early. It's
effectively restoring per pupil funding to 2010 levels. You've got a lost decade, haven't you, effectively, of growth in funding for comprehensive schools and state school pupils.
But also, as I just explained, we had to get through the financial crisis.
On the backs of
collapsed.
State school pupil funding.
That was well put by Sophie Ridge. It's true, we did have a financial crisis in 2008. Any government would have had to deal with that in some shape or form. But it was a political decision to do so on the backs of state school pupils. Let's get the graph up that Sky News showed there. As you can see, until the Tories came to power, growth in per pupil funding was tied in the private and state sectors. In 2010, funding for state school pupils and private school pupils was around 25% higher than it had been 6 years earlier. Then, in 2010, when the coalition comes to power, state spending per pupil plummets. Meanwhile, spending for private school students continues to rise. This comparison is important because it puts the lie to Zahawi's claim that a drop in state school funding was because we all needed to tighten our belts. His argument is that the financial crisis meant we just couldn't afford so much as before. We couldn't expect the same opportunities or the same standards of living. But what he ignores is that this logic only applied to some people. Those wealthy enough to send their kids to private school evidently didn't have to tighten their belts. Which is ironic, given that it's the parents of private school kids who are most likely to have actually been responsible for the banking crisis. In that exchange with Sophie Ridge, you heard Zahawi boasting that more money will now be going into state schools, and he fell back on that same answer in 3 more interviews.
Why did you deprive state school pupils of a quality education by taking money away from them to fix what happened in the banking crisis? Why did state school pupils have to suffer?
Well, first of all, there are schools in the state system, multi-academy trusts, have continued to outperform, which is the ones I want to scale and learn from them as to how they did that so well. But to your point, in the spending review, when I became Secretary of State, I got that investment. I got $7 billion into education.
We're talking about when you became Education Secretary. You were only recently Education Secretary. These pupils have had more than 10 years of underfunding. Have you seen the impact on state schools?
Let's just look at those numbers, shall we? Because the government spend on schools in 2022 to 2023 is $53.8 billion. Now, the IFS says now when accounting for inflation, which is the most important thing here, and higher costs, this is actually the same level as 15 years ago.
So, well, you'll remember 15 years ago, we had the financial crisis and the crash that we had to deal with when we came into office in coalition. And then we were hit by a global pandemic which the Chancellor made £400 billion available to protect jobs. 14 million people had that net of protection through the furlough scheme, through the pandemic. But we're back in real terms to that investment in education. I had the OECD head of education in my office last week. He said, actually, your spend on schools is right up there in the upper quartile of OECD countries. I had Andreas Schleicher from the OECD in my office a couple of weeks ago. He said, on schools, you're right up there in terms of investment in education.
Compared to what?
Compared to other OECD countries. That's a good thing. Now, how that money's spent sometimes...
Because the Netherlands consistently places higher than the UK in world education rankings. They've placed over 6 times the amount of catch-up funding per pupil than the UK has.
So I've got 5 billion, as well as 7 billion, I've got 5 billion in catch-up money.
Zahawi is right. The UK is in the top 25% of countries in the OECD when it comes to spending on education, but still, in my view, a pretty crappy defence. Yes, we defunded education, but it's still better than a bunch of other places. What happened to levelling up? You're not supposed to make it, there are other places which are worse. And if we are comparing Tory policies to what they inherited, it is just indefensible. Let's put Zahawi's 7 billion pledge in context. The Institute for Fiscal Studies show all that this money will do is get school funding back to where it was in 2010. 15 years later, you can see on this chart there's a long way to go to reverse the 9% cuts the Tories imposed on education. Millions of children will have started and completed their education entirely within the context of Tory austerity. What's more, wherever cuts took place, they hit the poorest the hardest. Spending on state secondary school pupils fell everywhere, but it fell most dramatically for the poorest pupils. Between 2009 and 2019, the lowest income group saw funding drop by a massive 14%. And one last graph, just to show you how they're doing things differently in other parts of the UK. While England, Wales and Northern Ireland have all seen funding fall relative to 2009 levels, in Scotland it has recovered, which could explain, one reason why the SNP might be so consistently popular.
There's a more general pattern here where the Tories routinely have independent advice which tells them that they're doing things dreadfully wrong. It's happened to Boris Johnson, it's happened to Nadhim Zahawi, and then they sack or ignore the independent advisors, or the independent advisors resign and say they can't do their jobs. In, I think it was 2012, Michael Gove, as Education Secretary, cancelled Building Schools for the Future, a plan to build more than 700 schools which had leaking roofs and crowded classrooms. Years later, Gove said he regretted cancelling it and just moved on. So right from the beginning of these austerity years, we've had devastation wrought against the public realm and against the future, against children's ability to learn in decent conditions in a wealthy country. The Tories slash and burn, see the damage it wreaks, years later say they're sorry, and then just move on. Sorry means I won't do it again. So why do they keep doing it? It shows a total ignorance, I think, about the long-term damage they're doing to this country. Children deprived of funding young, higher education then being strangled with massive pay cuts driving talent away from the sector. And then they swoop in with academization, handing schools over from the public to unelected and unaccountable bosses. So at every stage, from primary schools with their funding depleted, to secondary schools handed over to unaccountable academies, to universities in deep crisis as pay and pensions are cut for their lecturers. At every stage of education, we have a desperate crisis and we're going to slip down all kinds of league tables. And it's because of totally avoidable decisions taken by politicians. Of course, these are not the schools where politicians send their own children. Those schools are equipped with amazing technology, with space to work and to play. State schools had their playing fields sold off in the 1980s. That didn't happen in private schools. The schools where politicians send their children are equipped with all the best state-of-the-art facilities. I know because I went to one. And it's pretty shocking and striking, I guess it shouldn't shock us, to see the same people who send their own children to places where every opportunity is given to them, utterly casual about fiddling the statistics and ignoring independent advice so that most children in this country see their opportunities slide, wither and decline.
We can look at another sort of interesting part from that round of interviews. Nadhim Zahawi spoke to Times Radio about how he thought schools should teach the British Empire.
Kemi Badenoch was on Times Radio a short while ago talking about that people should be taught about the benefits of empire, not simply the criticisms of the British Empire, but the benefits of empire. Do you agree with her?
Yes, I do. Let me give you an example. You know that my parents fled Iraq because of Saddam Hussein. If you ask Iraqis, before the Ba'athist regime came into office, Saddam's cronies and criminals, Iraq was left a legacy of a British civil service system that actually served the country incredibly well for many, many decades. And that's the sort of thing that actually children should be learning about. And of course, all aspects of empire. And I think that's important.
Do you, as Education Secretary Nadhim Zahawi, do you worry about wokeness in schools? Do you ever spend any of your time thinking about the issue of wokeness in the education system?
I think I've got great teachers doing an incredible job. There's 461,000 teachers, 1 million people working in education. I think the important thing is to remember to teach children how to think, but not what to think. If we all focus on that, then we will do a great job for those young minds. So I'm fond of telling people my story about being an 11-year-old who couldn't speak a word of English, who had to string words together in his head to make a sentence and sort of hid at the back of the class, but had parents who had the wherewithal to help me focus on education. I want the system to work for every child, even those whose parents don't have the wherewithal or have no parents at all. And so let's teach children how to think, how to have those inquiring, inquisitive minds, rather than sort of bringing in our own politics or otherwise into the classroom.
And do you think that happens a little bit? Do you think that sometimes the politics does sneak into the classroom via the teachers?
Well, look, I think on the whole, and my experience, 12 years of being a member of Parliament, running in several elections, I never turned down a school hustings, because I think it's important for students to hear from the blue team and the red team and the yellow team and the green team. As long as teachers are giving students the ability to stress test arguments, to be able to see both sides of an argument, that is a great thing.
I mean, for one thing, it's striking how they construct a picture of left-wing dominance in every sphere of British life so that they can paint themselves, while they rule every roost, as the underdogs. Most kids in Britain brought up knowing about William Wilberforce, knowing about the great white noble Brits who helped abolish slavery. I remember wondering as a kid what they were even abolishing, because I was never taught about British role in the slave trade. 3 million people enslaved by the British. 17 billion pounds in today's money paid out in compensation, not to the slaves who didn't get a penny, but to slave owners. Some of the wealthiest people in Britain handed money when their slaves, 3 million of them, many of whom died in crowded conditions on those voyages over, were finally liberated. Ireland lost a quarter of its population to a colonially produced starvation, and they called it a famine. In the Bengal famine in 1943, 4 million people died, again abetted by deliberate colonial indifference, guarding with guns the food exported, while all around those containers, people starved and died. So ask yourself this: what does it tell us about the wealthy today and the powerful today that they don't want us talking about that? Why does talk of the rapacious exploitation of human beings make them queasy now? I think that's the question we don't ask enough, because the obvious conclusion is the true one, that our society is still premised on sucking blood from billions to adorn the gowns of a few. And so questions of empire are not distant or abstract or academic, and they're not only questions about the past either. When you see the contempt with which leaders dismiss the genocide of the colonized, the same leaders who scoff as people shiver in the cold right now or starve themselves to feed their kids know that this is what they think of you: expendable, immaterial, a resource for their wealth. That is why this matters. That is why fighting to ensure that we can have serious conversations about empire in Britain matters, because it tells us something about the nature of the British ruling class. It tells us something about the nature of British capitalism. When royals go to the Caribbean and patronize and wave to the locals, they're arriving in places that funded for centuries their wealth by extraction and slavery. This is the nature of British ruling class, and this is why they don't want us talking about these things. But it's not just a question of the past, it's a question of how they regard most of us here now in the present.